All right, everybody, welcome back. We are very closely getting to the end of our semester here. We got about 2.5 weeks left, and that last half week, I'm not sure how we're going to approach it because there's not really too much we can do in it. But regardless, as a result of that, we are moving away from Asia. We've talked about Japan, we talked about Korea. We're going to go to the Middle East, and we're going to start our discussion of the Middle East by talking about Israel and Palestine. This is going to be one of the big things going on in the region in terms of conflict and like news you might hear about, but it also serves the other purpose of allowing us to talk about American involvement in the region and some of the things that kind of increase hostility and anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. So with that being said, let's talk about Israel and Palestine and what I call the creation of conflict. We have a video to start us out with, which the embedded version is not working. You don't really need to do this stuff. Just kind of watch the video and see what's going on with it. We'll talk about it really briefly and move on after that. We'll watch it over on YouTube over here. Hopefully this doesn't get me like a copyright strike or anything. I don't think it really matters because this is just a temporary channel to do distance learning with. But yeah, let's watch it.
What we're looking at is basically one of the 5 Iron Dome missile batteries. Its goal is to, as much as possible, intercept rockets which have been launched towards the cities of Israel, to intercept them in the middle of the way, in the air, in order to protect the people.
כן, נופלים. אבל לא, גם מיירטים אותם, תראו. אני יודע. יש אבל פיצוצים, יש פיצוצים.
עבור אליי.
הנה האזעקה. אבל לא צילמת את האזעקה.
בוא איתנו, בוא.
בוא איתנו, בוא.
תשמע, איזה פיצוץ.
וואי, זה פה, ידבע. וואי. וואי, זה פה, יגנוב.
בוא, כנסו.
בוא, זה פה, קירי. זה עקיבת ברזל נראה לי, לא? כן. וואי.
לפני כיפת ברזל היה מה זה מפחיד, אבל היום אנחנו ממש בביטחון, אנחנו מרגישים וגם שומעים את הכיפה, בום, איך היא מורידה אותם, ואחר כך יוצאים, רואים את כל הזה.
It is very successful. I would say around 90% of the interceptions we wanted to make, we make. But still, there's too many rockets raining down here. Today only we had over 50 rockets already which hit Israeli territory and the cities and the land, wherever. And we had around 30 something interceptions.
כיפת ברזל הזה, אבל זה לא מצליח להעלות את כולם. הוא מנסה לפגוע כמה שאפשר, אבל במקרה המזל הוא פוגע בענייני. תראה מה שקרה פה.
What I can say is it's first of all not a 100% solution. It gives the people a better feeling, but there's still rockets landing. And it gives the IDF, more time actually to target Hamas and Islamic Jihad infrastructure, terror infrastructure, in the hope to somehow, impair their capabilities to stop this somehow.
You guys got a bonus of how the Trolls International let the dogs out. So kind of what I wanted to show with that is just the impact that this kind of long-term conflict can have, right? Like, I think the thing that sticks out to me the most is that group of, like, I guess I would call them kids. They're probably like early 20s or something, that are sitting outside there, and they're just like, oh yeah, there's some missiles coming down. Let's go check out the missiles. Like, you're in a situation where you are so, like, the idea of missiles hitting your city is so normalized that it's become like a spectator sport for them almost. So clearly there's a lot of conflict going on in Israel, and let's talk about where that comes from. I do want to kind of preface this with the idea that this is probably one of the most controversial and difficult to find objective information on topics that we have talked about. This is one of those things where, like, you'll see a lot of people with very, very strong opinions about it online. We have the one side of it, which, as you can see over here, the Jewish ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which shows the decreasing territory owned by Palestine. And there is definitely an argument out there that an ethnic cleansing is occurring and that we're seeing a genocide and that is happening. And that is obviously the more Palestinian side of things. And then you have the Israeli side of things, which, as you can see over here, is just, everything's lies. This land was British. It was not Palestinian. There's things to pick apart with both sides, but this argument, I take issue with illogical arguments. Like, it was British land, not but the British took it from the Palestinians. Like, it was a British colony of, but anyway, like, I'm not disputing this viewpoint as a whole. I'm disputing this particular part of the argument because that just is completely illogical. It doesn't make any sense. But basically, yeah, the idea that like the theft of land is a lie, that it was voted on, that it was supported, and that Israel is the rightful owner of that land. So you have the two very at odds side of this, and obviously because people are still currently being very affected by this, people get really passionate when they're talking about it. So it's one of those things where if you see people discussing it like in an online setting, which is where you're most likely to see it, keep in mind that there is probably some very strong biases at work, regardless of which side they're on, and that you should definitely be looking at this information very critically, because when people are that passionate about a subject, oftentimes things can get kind of warped. So the background behind this is this movement called Zionism. Zionism gets a lot of traction after World War II, but it actually had been around since like the early 1900s. And basically the idea of Zionism is that Jewish people had historically been persecuted like all throughout European history, not just the Holocaust. Like my go-to example goes all the way back to the Crusades. When the Crusades happened and, it was Christian Europe attacking Islamic Middle East, the Crusades also targeted Jewish people. Jewish people in Europe have always been an outside group, and therefore they have always been treated as an outside group and targeted with violence. So Zionism said the only way to escape that is to get our own homeland. And if you're Jewish, where else to get a good homeland than your historical homeland, which would be modern-day Israel. But unfortunately for the Jewish people that wanted to move there, that is now, or was now, owned by a group of people called the Palestinians. It was Palestine. So after World War II, Palestine is a British colony, and the European powers and America are getting rid of their colonies after World War II, but they still have them at the end of the war. And there's very much this sentiment that because of the Holocaust and how bad things were, the Jewish community needs protection, right? So Zionism finally gets this recognition from Britain, from America, from the West. And again, because it had been around since the early 1900s, there was already a pretty significant number of Jewish people that had moved to Palestine regardless. But now Britain is going to decide that maybe they should lift some of those restrictions they've put in place and start allowing more of a transition there. This then is going to escalate even further when Britain goes, you know what, this is like way too much of a headache for us to deal with. We are kind of getting rid of our colonies anyway, except for India. We're going to hold on to that one, and then they actually end up not holding on to that one. We are just going to leave Palestine. So they announced that in 1947, like, we're done. We're not a part of this anymore. This is your guys' headache to figure out. If the Jewish people want to move here, whatever, let them move here. In fact, we got a brand new organization whose sole job it is to figure out stuff like this. It's the UN. So the UN decides to put together a special committee in 1947 to try to deal with this issue. And what they come up with is basically this proposal over here. The idea is they're going to get rid of the British mandate, which is their control over the colony, with an independent Arab state, an independent Jewish state, and then the city of Jerusalem, which would actually not belong to either of them, even though it would be smack dab in the middle of the Arab state over here. But it would actually be held by an international trusteeship system. And the reason for that is Jerusalem is a holy city for 3 different religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. You can't really give that to one country without those other groups freaking out, right? So if you gave it to the Arab state, then the Jewish state and probably a lot of Christian countries would be upset. If you gave it to the Jewish state, the Arab state, and then probably also a decent number of Christian countries would be upset. So the UN recognizes this as a problem, and they decide to deal with it by making that a separate thing. There's some pretty clear problems with this one. Number one, neither side's going to be happy, right? Neither side gets the full country, which is what they want. But number two, why does Europe in particular, but like, just the UN in general, did we not learn our lesson with the Treaty of Versailles that it's a stupid idea to split up territory? Like, why do this? I could only assume, and maybe they're trying to, honor the places where Jewish people have already moved in. But if you're going to be redrawing borders anyway, it just seems like it would make more sense just like cut it in half, or cut it down the middle or something. Well, probably not down the middle, because then one group would have access to the sea and one wouldn't, and that'd be bad. Yeah, so just like cut it in half or something. What is this nonsense? That's crazy, right? So that is going to cause a lot of potential problems. Not just that, Jerusalem putting it in the middle of this Arab state here, even if you make it an international trusteeship system, the Jewish side of things are not going to be happy, because then their access to it is going to be cut off. It's an interesting plan, and it's a good idea to split it up like this, but kind of doing it in this pattern is an interesting decision. So the considerations here, and yeah, I guess you don't really need this for notes. It's not super important. So as I mentioned, Jerusalem is a holy city for 3 different religions. Other Arab nations are going to see this at best as an insult. At worst, what they're going to view it as is an attack. Because think about what we're seeing here. We're seeing the UN, which is basically a bunch of Western Christian countries, coming in and taking territory from an Arab state to make a Jewish state in the Middle East. That on its own would already be bad enough, but I mentioned earlier the Crusades, and I used them as an example for a reason. There is a historical precedent in the Middle East that is not forgotten of Christian countries coming in and invading and waging a holy war against the Middle East, right? So there is a huge concern here of how are those other Arab nations going to react to this. On top of that, and as a result of that, Israel is not going to be a immediately independent, self-sufficient country. It's going to need support from the international community pretty much no matter how you do this. That is a big problem, because supporting one side might turn the other side against you, right? If you support Israel, then the Arab nations are going to get mad at you. If you support the Arab nations, then the Israel nation is going to get mad at you and any of its supporters in Europe. This on its own is already a problem, because it could result in like warfare or diplomatic problems, but keep in mind the context of the time period. It's post-World War II, which means it is the Cold War. And in the Cold War, it is very important to get as many people on your side as possible and to convince them of your way of thinking. So if you're America, for example, and you choose to support Israel, and that turns a bunch of Arab nations against you, you have the very real concern in that Cold War mentality of that's going to drive those Arab nations into the hands of Russia. That could be an issue. So on top of that, there's already a significant number of displaced Jewish people living in Palestine. So no matter which way you go, right? If you give more territory to Palestine, then you're looking at displaced Jewish people. If you're giving it more to the Jewish community, then you're looking at displaced Palestinians. Then you have the guilt the Western world feels about the Holocaust, because we definitely could have been more proactive in stopping that. A bunch of Western nations turned away boatloads of Jewish people during and leading up to World War II because we were also very anti-Semitic. And we, in America's case, and in several other countries, we specifically said, we have enough Jewish people, we don't want any more Jewish people. So now in the kind of the aftermath and seeing what happened with the Holocaust, we are kind of feeling like we owe it to the Jewish community to help them. So we need something to do here, and we can't just do nothing, because tensions are already starting to lead to violence at this point. So we know if we do nothing, it's going to be a bloodbath. So it's a bad situation all the way down. So the outcome here is the plan does go through. The Jewish community accepts it, the Arab community rejects it, and the UN goes, that's good enough for us, and they push it through. In May of 1948, then, the head of the Jewish Agency declared the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel, and this is then finally where Israel becomes a thing. It wasn't a thing before 1948 in terms of how we recognize modern Israel. Now it is a thing. Immediately, and by immediately I mean the next day, 4 major Arab countries, basically the neighboring countries of Israel, invaded. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq all invade the day after Israel is declared a state. That's not good. So fighting is going to go on for a year. A ceasefire is finally going to be signed. Temporary borders are going to be agreed to. And Israel actually holds out pretty well here. And that's mainly a result of the support they have received from the West. Israel's military and their economy and just their overall funding and support is pretty dang high. So that allows them to hold off really well, because most Middle Eastern countries at this point are not really that industrialized. They're not that advanced. So Israel is able to hold their place. During this conflict, then, we start to see the movement, the seizure of territory from Palestinians to Israel. It's estimated that about 700,000 Palestinians were either expelled from or fled from Israeli forces during the conflict in Israeli territory. So we have then a kind of more neutral version of the map I showed you at the beginning with the 2 sides on it. So this is 1946, before all the breakdown happened. And again, you can kind of see like up here how that matches in terms of the Jewish land, Jewish population, how that matches the UN proposal. But then all of this territory was given to the Jewish state, which there's not really a Jewish majority there. So I'm not sure what would be going on with that. But regardless, this is the final partition plan that is decided upon. Again, up here, very similar pattern. Down here, not so much. Jerusalem is a part of that Palestinian nation. But then already as we get into 1949 to 1967, that land starts getting chipped away. Gaza here goes down to just the Gaza Strip. You can see the West Bank over here is very much being reduced down. They lose this entire area up here. And then up by 2000, there's even less. And we'll talk a little bit more, kind of the videos you'll see this week talk about a lot about how settlements come in and take this territory, and it starts getting chipped more and more and more away. So there's going to be a progression of this trend. So modern territorial division. What does that look like? So Palestine, as we saw there, has Gaza and the West Bank. This does include East Jerusalem. You can see that Jerusalem, and it might be easier to see here. Yeah, so on this one, you can see Jerusalem's right here. This one is just a little bit too busy to really make that distinction there. So Jerusalem is kind of split. It's mostly in Israeli territory, but there's a little bit in Palestinian territory. But again, as we can see here, that's only technically Palestinian territory, right? These are the official borders of the West Bank, but because of settlements and because of the way that land has been kind of claimed, not really. Israel then has everything else. The Golan Heights are kind of a weird kind of in-between area where it's technically claimed by both, but especially in recent times, Israel has gotten more aggressive with claiming that as their area. So this obviously results in huge amounts of conflict. On top of that, you have a leadership issue because they tend to butt heads a lot on it. Israel is a parliamentary democracy. They've got a very large number of parties. That means they have a very large number of ideas that come with those parties. But in general, there is a much more conservative, kind of obviously pro-Israel, but in terms of this conflict, pro-Israeli aggression kind of majority that is present in the Israeli government. Palestine has kind of a split because their territory is split, right? So Gaza Strip and the West Bank are technically under one government, but then they're kind of also separate as well. So you get the Palestinian National Authority in the West Bank, and then you get Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And by the way, as I always do, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing a bunch of words. Please forgive me. So Hamas, the problem with that being leadership, when I mentioned leadership issues, Hamas is also recognized as a terrorist organization by a lot of countries because in general, not always, but in general, like when we saw that Iron Dome video, the people launching those rockets, that's Hamas. So it makes it very hard for the governments of Palestine and Israel to get along because the Israeli government tends to be very pro-Israeli military and Israeli aggression. And in fact, I think it was 2016 or 2017. It was within the past like 5 or 6 years. The Israeli government said that settlements were actually okay. And because I keep on mentioning them and they're going to come up in the video, settlements are basically like mostly you see them in the West Bank because there's not that much room in Gaza Strip. So this is all Palestinian territory. But there's a bunch of Israelis that want to expand outwards. So you'll get like an Israeli community that goes, oh, nobody's using this territory right here. We're just going to build a housing settlement here. Which is not, like that'd be like Canada coming across the border of America and being like, hey, this open field here, nobody's really using that. So we're just going to claim that for Canada and make like, a suburb there. So obviously that makes Palestine really mad. It causes a bunch of issues internationally. So the Israeli government was like, yeah, those are fine. You can keep on doing those. And they've started getting more aggressive with making them since then. So that's where the Israeli government is coming from. And then you have the Palestinian government, which at least partially is being led by a recognized terrorist organization that is launching missiles at Israel. It makes it very, very hard then to have any kind of diplomatic relationship with each other when that is what you're working with. In terms of who's supporting who, in general, not 100%, but in general, Israel is supported by the West. That includes America. In fact, America has been one of their longest standing, most vital allies. And Palestine, and again, not 100%, but pretty much 100%, is supported by Muslim countries. Obviously the Middle East, but keep in mind there's a lot of non-Middle East Muslim countries, and they are generally going to support Palestine as well. Iran and Syria in particular are very anti-Israel. And that is notable because think of like who some of our historically biggest enemies in the region have been. Iran and Syria are right up there on that list. And this is not the only reason, but it's definitely a big part of that reason. Egypt supports Palestine, but thanks to the Camp David Accords and Jimmy Carter, we actually, and by we I mean America, were able to kind of get a tentative peace between Egypt and Israel, and like it's kind of been off and on since then. So Egypt is kind of like a weird in-between one. In terms of how this conflict is continuing and how the partition of the country is enforced, Israel has a big old defensive wall they built on the West Bank. So that giant concrete just dividing structure you can see here has been built to block off that whole area. We have the Iron Dome, which we saw in the, or they have the Iron Dome, which we saw in the video. They have missile strikes because they fire missiles into especially the Gaza Strip because that's where Hamas is. But yeah, they do like military attacks as well. And obviously they patrol a lot with their military. Palestine in return also does a lot of missile strikes. There's a lot more terrorist tactics going on because Palestine in general is not nearly as advanced as Israel is, right? So they can't really do a head-to-head military conflict. So there's going to be a lot more like guerrilla tactics, which in the Middle East comes into terrorism. So suicide bombings, car bombings, that kind of stuff. The results of this then is just nonstop violence. Basically, the results are kind of what we saw in that first video. It's what you're going to see in the conflict zone videos you're going to watch later. It's what you can see in this picture here. There's terrorist attacks coming from Palestine. There are missile attacks coming from Israel, which frequently hit civilian targets. Israel would argue that they are specifically targeting, Hamas, but Palestine in turn argues that like a lot of those missile strikes are frustration strikes from Israel that are not really targeting anything. They're just trying to punish Palestine. And regardless of who is right there, the reality is that a lot of the people that get hit by those missiles are civilians, in the same way that a lot of the people in Israel that are hit by the Hamas missiles are civilians. This has a huge amount of debate within the country, and then there's also international debate over like who's in the right and who's in the wrong and what should be done. And that's further blurred by the fact that, America, being one of Israel's biggest supporters, is on the UN Security Council. So we have a lot of ability to block anything against Israel. And that has caused a lot of animosity towards America, because America has been so proactive in supporting Israel. That has caused, that's where a lot of the anti-American sentiment in the Middle East comes from. And if you're like, why are we, supporting Israel so much? Part of it is because, we do view them as an ally, but especially during the Cold War, Israel was our only, for sure foothold in the region, right? So we wanted to keep that foothold no matter what, even if it resulted in some pretty shady stuff that we were supporting. In the modern world, it's now more, well, Israel's been our ally for so long, and we're supporting them because of that. So America is very much entrenched in the pro-Israel standpoint. We've actually gotten even more pro-Israel since Trump came into office. Again, I think it was 2017, Trump actually, Israel declared that Jerusalem was going to be their capital, which obviously made a lot of people really mad. And Trump was one of the few international leaders that was like, yeah, that sounds good. America will recognize that. And that resulted in a huge amount of international backlash as well. So there's still kind of ongoing stuff in terms of that support. Just to give you an idea of just how much conflict the presence and actions of Israel cause in the Middle East, this is by no means a complete list. This is just kind of like a highlight reel of the conflicts that have happened since Israel kind of became a power in the Middle East. And again, this isn't, a lot of these aren't even a result of Israel's actions. It's just that Israel exists, right? And that makes a lot of Middle Eastern countries very upset, especially early on. So you get the Suez War in 1956. We actually talked about this one way back at the beginning of the year. That's where Israel was in cahoots with Britain and France to try to get the Sinai Peninsula so that Britain and France could have control of the Suez Canal. And, well, we know how that backfired. That was pretty bad. In 1967, you get the Six-Day War, where Israel decides that their neighboring countries, mainly Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, are being a little bit too aggressive, so they are going to preemptively attack. They're going to do one of those defensive attacks. Sure, why not? Because those countries are building up troops on their border, right? They're posturing aggressively. So Israel attacks, and they more than double their territory in 6 days. A lot of that territory they have to eventually give back, but that's where you get things like the Golan Heights kind of coming in here. In 1973, you get the Yom Kippur War. I know I pronounced that wrong just now. That was Egypt and Syria attacking Israel on a Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. Is it Kippur? Sure, why not? To get some of their land back, they failed in that. Then you get the first Intifada. There's been several actually, from 1987 to 1993, and this was specifically Palestine. So the other conflicts we saw were their neighboring countries attacking. This is Palestinians rising up against Israel. There's going to be a bunch of violent and some non-violent actions, a huge number of suicide attacks, basically bombings, and all kinds of innocent civilians getting killed. On both sides, because obviously the Palestinians attack first. That causes a lot of Israeli casualties. The Israelis then retaliate. That causes a lot of Palestinian casualties. The more modern version of this, I kind of give one specific example of the Gaza war, but there's been conflict going on between the Gaza Strip and Israel basically from the early to mid 2000s to now. Even in modern times, there's still conflict revolving around this, right? But the one I picked specifically was like kind of like the big centerpiece, the Gaza War in 2008 to 2009. This was about 3 weeks of fighting, so it happened at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. Basically, Israel just started firing into Gaza and attacking into Gaza because they're like, we're sick of you guys firing rockets at us, so we're going to retaliate against you. There's 3 weeks of fighting, and it's pretty much exclusively Palestinian casualties. The goal of getting that rocket fire to stop was successful. It didn't really stop, it reduced it. But there's a huge amount of damage to the reputation of Israel here just because of the sheer amount of Palestinian casualties, and a lot of those being civilians. So even internationally, there was a lot of backlash against Israel for this. And all of this is important not just for the Middle East, but for America. Because America supporting Israel, as I mentioned before, gets us a lot of animosity. And it's kind of our entryway, right? It's our gateway drug, so to speak, into the Middle East, because we start getting more and more involved with other Middle Eastern countries due to our involvement there, and of course the Cold War. So the Iran-Iraq War is a great example. I'm just going to, again, very quick highlight reels. Each one of these could be like its own PowerPoint, but we're not going to do that. Of America getting involved. And I kind of end this PowerPoint this way because even though it's not directly related to Israel, it ties directly into our next subject, which is terrorism in the Middle East, right? So in 1980 to 1988, there's a war between Iran and Iraq. That's got nothing to do with America, right? But Cold War. We want to support Iraq because we're hoping that will give them a little bit more of a reason to like us and be anti-Russian, and the Russians are kind of supporting Iran, and we don't like Iran, and we didn't really like Iraq either, but we liked them more than we liked Iran. So America can't just like not get involved in a war that doesn't involve us, right? We have to get involved. So we do, and unfortunately we are extra shady in our involvement, because in addition to, the normal like tactical support and stuff, like, giving them like radar information and things like that, we also sell them weapons. And among those weapons are chemical and biological weapons. And you might be like, wait a minute, chemical warfare is a war crime. Yes, it is. And when Iraq uses those chemical weapons against Iran and also Kurdish citizens in Iraq, because the Kurds, you might recognize them because they're an ethnic minority. We talk about them every now and then because they're still being persecuted in the Middle East. The Kurds were persecuted, and Iraq used our chemical weapons against them in addition to the Iranians. And when the UN tried to condemn Iraq for that, America and also Britain, we weren't alone in this, but yeah, America and Britain used their position in the UN to stop that. Oops, that's not very democratic. It's not very democratic of us. I was going to say maybe it's democratic, but it's not democratic. It's definitely not like morally justifiable of us. We helped a country that turned out to be our enemy use chemical warfare. And by the way, a lot of those weapons that we sold to them, Iraq later used against us because we fought Iraq multiple times. And then those weapons found their way into the hands of terrorists who are currently using them against us. And we also funded a bunch of terrorists. We'll talk about that when we get to Al-Qaeda. So next up was the Gulf War. And even though we just helped Iraq then turned around and did something we didn't like. First, they invaded Kuwait. And then they were going to invade Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is one of our other friends in the region, and also we get a lot of oil from them. So we couldn't let that happen. So we came in and we stopped Iraq. We did a pretty extensive air campaign against them. We had very much air superiority against Iraq, and we used that to bomb the hell out of them. Completely stopped them from invading Saudi Arabia. We kicked them out of Kuwait. But because a lot of that bombing ended up hitting civilian targets, which is a very common trend for America's bombing in the Middle East, that makes a lot of people really mad at us, which then becomes a recruitment tool for terrorist organizations and other anti-American organizations. And you also get such really iconic photos as this one. As Iraq retreated through Kuwait, they decided if we can't have the oil, nobody can. Well, they can eventually, but they're going to have to wait for the fire to go out because we're going to set fire to all the oil wells. So as we're retaking Kuwait, it's a victory. It looks like just like a disaster hellscape because you have all these oil wells that are just spouting out fire because they were set on fire by the retreating Iraqis. Then 9/11 happens. And again, we'll talk about Al-Qaeda and how 9/11 happened and why it happened next week. But basically, 9/11 happens, and we invade two countries as a result, and then those two countries kind of shotgun us out into a much broader involvement into the Middle East as a whole. The correct country to invade, the one that actually was connected to Al-Qaeda, was Afghanistan. So the war in Afghanistan technically was from 2001 to 2014. And that's when like NATO was involved, but American involvement is still pretty much ongoing. We haven't been able to completely leave the region. So kind of still 2001 to present. The idea here was Al-Qaeda was largely based out of Afghanistan. They were supported by the government of Afghanistan, which was led by another terrorist group called the Taliban. And the Taliban was already a group we didn't like, so we figured we could take out two birds with one stone. We could remove the Taliban from power, and we could take down Al-Qaeda. NATO got involved because a bunch of other Western countries also didn't like Al-Qaeda and Taliban, and they were supporting us, in our response to 9/11 because it was a kind of international tragedy and kind of unprecedented event at that point. So NATO was involved for about 13 years before they finally withdrew in 2014, which is when a lot of American troops also withdrew, but then we stayed around for a bit. We did succeed in taking the Taliban out. But the problem is you can't really annihilate a terrorist group that well. So the Taliban was and kind of is still present in Afghanistan. They just became an insurgency group, and aka a terrorist group, right? So we put a new government in power in Afghanistan, but we can't really leave them there on their own because they will get destroyed by the Taliban and the other terrorists, and then Afghanistan will just become a power vacuum, which will allow either a dictator or another terrorist group to take charge. So we need to stay in the region, and it just becomes this quagmire, kind of like Vietnam, that we can never leave. Al-Qaeda, meanwhile, we do eventually take out Osama bin Laden, but the problem is Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization was not really tied to Afghanistan, so they could just leave. And in fact, a lot of them just fled into Pakistan. And unless we wanted to invade Pakistan as well, we couldn't really follow Al-Qaeda there. So we couldn't really get rid of Al-Qaeda either. So we had some success there, but also a lot of problems. And then that very much balloons out our involvement in the region. Then the other war. Oh man, this war. The Iraq War. This one, again, technically 2003 to 2011, but as a result of what happens in Iraq, our involvement, and by our involvement I mean America, is very much extended, and we are still kind of involved in that area. We invaded Iraq. And you might be like, why did we invade Iraq? That is a good question. The main claims, like the very main claim pushed by the American government and by the Bush administration, is that the government of Iraq had access to WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. And they insisted that they had proof of this. The problem is they didn't have proof of that. And the even bigger problem is, after the fact, there has been no investigation that can show any real evidence that Iraq had access to WMDs. So either they were amazingly good at hiding them, or they didn't have WMDs. And for the record, it's very, very hard to hide nuclear weapons because you can very easily find the facilities used to make them. And the idea of radiation, like you can't even if you take the nuclear weapons away, the radiation still sticks around, right? So you could, anyway, it's very unlikely they had WMDs. The other claim that was thrown out there, this was more by other politicians within America, but also kind of put out there by the government itself, was, we got to stop Al-Qaeda. The problem with that is Saddam Hussein was a horrible dictator. like a horrendous human being, just really bad, like tortured his own people. But he hated Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda represented a threat to his power. So he didn't let Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he was actually an enemy of Al-Qaeda. So that then leaves a lot of doubt as to why. And I'll show you two pictures on the next and final slide. We'll talk a little bit more maybe about why. The end results of the Iraq War, though, we do take out Hussein. Saddam Hussein, no longer in power. He is actually put on trial and executed, which honestly is good. Again, like you guys didn't really grow up in the 90s, so you like Saddam Hussein might not even be a name that you recognize. But when I was a kid in the 90s growing up, Saddam Hussein was kind of like Kim Jong-un, basically. Like everybody knew him and everybody knew how bad of a person he was, and like he was a really bad person. So him getting taken out, that's good. But is it worth 8 years of war and like increased terrorism and all that other stuff? Because that's what happens. In fact, our presence in Iraq and the new government in Iraq leads directly to, it's not like this one thing that creates ISIL and puts them on the front stage, but it's a big part of it. ISIL, which is the same thing as ISIS, basically, enters the global stage in 2014 when they invade northern Iraq. And because Iraq is now an ally of America, because we made sure they had a democratic government that we approved of, so democratic kind of in air quotes there, that requires America to get involved in Iraq again. And then we get further involved in the region, and then that gets us involved further with ISIS and all this stuff that comes out of that. So my last kind of point here, just to emphasize how much of just a mess the Iraq War was. You can see on the left here, this is a Time magazine poll. So this is actually a poll of American people. This is not the international community who's going to have an even more pessimistic view of America. This is what Americans think. Like, why are we invading Iraq? To get Iraq's oil. And that is especially, I think it's kind of hilarious because the original name for the operation in Iraq was Operation Iraqi Liberation. And it was put out there to the press, and it was announced to everybody, and people immediately started pointing out, that spells oil. Operation Iraqi Liberation spells oil. And then we changed the name of the operation to Operation Iraqi Freedom because, oops. So it was now OIF. I feel like if they could have just like Operation Order and Freedom, like, I don't know, so like it could have been OOF is all I'm saying. Like OOF would have been a more appropriate acronym for this particular war. The other big like, oh my God, why would you do that of this? You might have heard of the Mission Accomplished speech slash like press announcement before, but basically it was like 3 weeks or 6 weeks. It was really early into the conflict. Bush actually like did a speech on an aircraft carrier, and somebody decided it would be a good idea to put up this banner in the background: Mission Accomplished. In 2003. The Iraq War didn't end until 2011, and we're still kind of involved there. So even at the time, people are like, "What are you talking about? Mission accomplished? Like we didn't accomplish anything." So basically, the Iraq War was just all the way down. It was a mess, and the end result of all of this is, regardless of what gains we make in the region, every single one of these conflicts ratchets up anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. And that is what gets us involved in what we're stuck in the region with now, which is kind of like this endless problem with terrorism and a bunch of unstable and often hostile governments and like these diplomatic quagmires of how do we deal with like even the countries that aren't really like full-on terrorists, like Iran, for example. Iran does not like America, and dealing with them diplomatically is a big difficulty, and a lot of that is a result of stuff like this. So Anyway, we will, for the second part of this week, watch a couple of pretty short videos. It's kind of 4 parts of one larger video, talking about kind of both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And next week we will talk in much more detail about terrorism and how that's come down. You'll get to watch a video of ISIS doing donuts in a tank. So look forward to that next week as well. Bye.